Okay, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jerry Singerman, Senior Humanities Editor Emeritus from the University of Pennsylvania Press, one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zach Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollock, Curator of Research Services here at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. And we're kept on track on all matters administrative and technological by Peter Diamond, the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. But as all of you who had the good fortune of attending or tuning in last week know, Peter's talents go far, far beyond managing these tasks. And his contribution to the semester and to the full year has really been great. So, but now Peter has returned to his workaday role, and he is circulating an attendance sheet that we ask those of you present to sign. And he will, as always, curate the chat during the talk for our silenced Zoomers. I do encourage all of our remote guests to speak in their own voices once we move to the Q&A, and Peter will alert us to people using the raised hand function. So that we may recognize you all. So it is a particular pleasure to welcome Geoffrey Turnovsky as this afternoon's speaker. Jeff took his undergraduate degree from Williams College and his MPhil and PhD in comparative literature from Columbia University. The small minority of us with long and intact institutional memories, and I think that may be me and John, I don't know, will recall that young Jeff, when there was like no snow in his hair, right, was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Penn Humanities Forum, that is the predecessor to the Wolf Humanities Forum, during the academic year 2002 to 3. So that, of course, was but a way station on the way to Ohio State, where he was assistant professor of French from 2003 until 2006, and then on to the University of Washington, where he has taught ever since. At Washington, he currently holds the rank of professor in the Department of French and Italian Studies. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of History, and he's co-founder and co-director, along with Jeffrey Knight, of the undergraduate and graduate programs in textual and digital studies. Now, I had the pleasure of working with Jeff on his 2010 Penn Material Texts volume, The Literary Market, Authorship and Modernity in the Old Regime, a book in which he convincingly and somewhat counterintuitively argued that in the 18th century, at least, authors were not slaves to the market, but actually liberated by it. As David Coward wrote in a Times Literary Supplement review, that paired Jeff's book with another Penn book that happened to be by Robert Darnton, The Devil in the Holy Water. Turnovsky's, quote, literary market emerged as an honorable alternative to the traditional aristocratic field of patronage. Its values were of the mind rather than the wallet. The commercialization of literature was thus mirrored by the decommercialization of the man of letters. Jeff Turnovsky's longstanding interests in the history of print, books, authorship, and reading in early modern Europe extend these days to the history of technological change, the evolution and remediation of textual archives from manuscript to print, and from print into data and digital formats. These are all at play in his recent book, Reading Typographically, Immersed in Print in Early Modern France, which appeared last year from Stanford University Press. This new book, in his own words, quote, explores the formation of new reading practices in early modern France, characterized by moralized experiences of absorption and interpersonal bonds with characters and authors. These experiences are analyzed in light of typographic and commercial innovations in the print world that transformed the book into a medium for human connection, end quote. But how did we come to see the printed book in particular as especially suited to deliver this experience of immersive reading, he asks, and has the advent of digital reading and the rapid development of AI ruptured this relationship of reader to text? Print-based reading practices have always included a wide range of modes, he reminds us, not the least of which is the disjointed scanning that we associate today with electronic text. and AI itself is deeply rooted in the forms and technologies of print culture. The project of reading typographically is one that has been described by Roger Chartier as important, innovative, provocative, and exciting, and I strongly suspect that Roger and all of us are on the verge of hearing more about it. So let me delay no further in turning the floor over to Geoffrey Turnovsky, speaking this evening on characters, epistolary novels, and the analog history of AI.
Right. Thanks so much, Jared. That was very nice and anticipates. I had a little spiel here about my my history with this place, and I think you summarized it very well, better than I would. But I did want to begin by thanking sincerely the organizers of this seminar for the chance to present, Jerry, Zachary Lesser, John Pollock, and thanks particularly to Peter Diamond for all the arrangements. And as Jerry already suggested, this series and Penn generally has always had a kind of a special place for me. And I was here in 2002, 2003 in what was then the Penn Humanities Forum. It was part of a seminar organized by Peter Stallybrass that year on the book. And I really just can't overstate how formative that year was and really continues to be for me. I had just come out of Columbia French, comparative literature too, but in those days, comparative literature was this kind of interdisciplinary program you did in and through a more traditional language department. And Columbia was, the bastion of literary theory. It was the temple of Michael Riffater and Henri Mitterrand. I learned a lot from them, but I was more interested in texts in the real world. So I was kind of drawn to these sociologically inflected people like Andreas Hewson in German, who taught the Frankfurt School, and especially to Priscilla Ferguson, who was both in French, but then moved into sociology, sociologist of literature, very much in the mold of Bourdieu. And that was really kind of where I was coming from initially as I came here, was this sort of application of Bourdieu style kind of sociology, the field, to thinking about the history of literary texts. Very sadly, Priscilla passed away in 2019, but that was very important for me. But all to say that, coming here with that background and then learning about book history and bibliography, it was an amazing year, and it's really stuck with me, and it's really shaped, I think, everything I've done since then. So it's a real pleasure to be back here. I have come back here since, including a couple of years ago to hear Roger. Oh, and I met Roger that year too. Not the least important part of that year by any stretch of the imagination. And as Jerry suggested, I was so happy to publish what came out of all of that with the material text series with the University of Pennsylvania Press. What I want to present to you today reflects, I think, another very transitional moment as I work from one project, which Jerry very nicely described, which was this book, Reading Typographically, which was published last summer, towards the next thing, which indeed emerges from this work. And I do start with a caveat, which is that this is going to be more of a kind of high altitude survey of a series of questions that I'm trying to pursue, not so much a deep dive into a particular archive. That's kind of where I am right now, even though probably I'd prefer in this context to be talking more about, a specific archive. But I have this long-standing interest in technological change, the question of technological change, which Jerry mentioned, how to talk about it, how to understand it. And I think at one level, this moment, there's a need for a more nuanced and critical reflection about how such change happens. We're, currently swamped in AI-related propaganda or intense consternation about AI. But all of it, whether pro and con, tends to amplify narratives about the revolutionary or unprecedented nature of the shift. It's been interesting for me to see from afar as I've tried to dial into colloquium sessions this year from Seattle. It's always an obvious thing to be able to do, but when I can, I try. We're 3 hours earlier. A mounting interest against these types of models in through explorations of what I'd call the analog history of the digital, the deep roots of the digital and the evolutions of analog technologies going back centuries. Just this past semester, we heard a session on the development of binary code with the telegraph in the 19th century with Whitney Tretian. Lisa Gittleman discussed AI in relation to typography, which is something I'll be talking about as well. It's grateful to Peter and Lisa for letting me see the recording of her talk, which I unfortunately couldn't make that particular week live. And I've, of course, long focused on the impacts of printing technologies and typography, and the same debates and counter debates have prevailed there, as you know, was there a printing revolution or not? It's an old question, and I hesitate to belabor it, but it's a question I don't think has been resolved in an especially satisfactory way, partly because I think it's generally been very badly posed as a yes or no question. Blaise Pascal, describing his own rhetorical approach in what would become known as the Pensée 17th century text, writes, as he's talking about man, he's talking about l'homme, if he praises himself, I diminish him. If he diminishes himself, I praise him. I contradict him always until he comes to understand that he is an incomprehensible monster. I think this works well as a template for the question of technological change. It's not a yes or no question. The truth lies in what Pascal called the contrariété, the contradictions that somehow inhabit the same space. New technologies represent both disruptions and continuities. Disruptions and continuities that moreover exist in and through each other and define each other. I quickly cite Peter Stallybrass here on the idea of the manuscript. There are no manuscripts until there's print. The word, and perhaps even the concept, doesn't exist. The first attestation of the term in the Oxford English Dictionary, as Peter showed, was from the end of the 16th century. The continuity represented by scribal culture is established in and through the disruption of the introduction of printing technologies. You can downplay the impact of print by pointing to all the mistakes that early printers continued to make, potentially more than scribes made. They made many, or to their ruthlessly self-serving business practices, all of which made the early printed text hardly more reliable and stable than handwritten text, and maybe less reliable. On the other hand, you have the reality of a locked-in form as a defining gesture in letterpress printing. You can't print off type that hasn't been tightly secured and fixed in place. And this physical, mechanical fixing surely shapes the text that is printed off of the form. Yes, a chase can be unlocked and alterations made. Type can also break in the course of a print run. But I think it's counterintuitive to think that copies pulled off of a locked-in form, notwithstanding all of these contingencies, aren't going to seem identical in ways that would change conceptions of what a copy is, and by extension of what a text being copied is, and a text that's constituted in and through all of the copies of it. That, in my view, is an assertion that's not in contradiction with the notion that, to take a semi-random example, no two copies of Shakespeare's First Folio are exactly the same. I think we need a different language to talk about typographical variants than one that is sort of too derived, excessively derived perhaps from kind of medieval notions of mouvance, for example, medieval sort of textual instability. This isn't to say, on the other hand, that revolution narratives haven't underplayed continuities. Often I think because the continuities can seem so obvious that they're either not seen or they're not seen as noteworthy. But they are noteworthy, and more, they're constitutive of the changes. I think that's the case today with upheavals around AI and more broadly the digital. This is partly what I want to talk about today, continuities that we are predisposed not to see. But it's true historically too. A continuity played down in accounts of the printing revolution, from Fèvre, Martin to Eisenstein to much of the discourse in print we encounter today. We'll see some examples in a second. Is something many of you in this room have talked about, which is the all-important continuity represented by the Codex book, which printers just adopted from scribes who'd been evolving the platform for a millennium. I mean, print becomes very identified with the book, but it's not the same thing. I think today we're particularly well positioned to appreciate this print-book distinction insofar as the most dramatic disruptions of the digital age target the codex more than print per se. This is the fallacy of Sven Burkhart's, among others, lamenting the loss of print's quote-unquote linearity and of print's associations with cognitive powers like concentration and focus manifested in undistracted and absorptive reading. But the logic of print isn't the sequential turning of pages he evokes. He's talking about books here, not print, and the bibliographic order in which text is indexed to volumes and pages. And by extension, to authors, at least as Antoine Furtière defined that notion, those who have brought to light a book of some kind. It's the order of the book, not of print, that's threatened by searches that don't seek titles, volumes, pages, or authors. This is the metadata of the bibliographical order. But that scour the web for strings of characters. These strings may well correspond, in our minds as humans, to titles and authors. But the search engine doesn't know that. and isn't searching for them as such. Results are weighted by popularity and predictive algorithms and delivered as snippets, to recall the language of the Google copyright case, more or less decontextualized from the books in which the information had been originally published and long archived and accessed. If the information had been published in a book to begin with, which of course is a tiny, tiny fraction of the text on the web. By contrast, algorithmic search is more aligned with print in that another defining logic of print alongside the logic of the locked-in form lies in what you see here, the punch in the matrix, which in the context of late medieval Europe opened up, or maybe reopened, the regime of the character, which is today the basic unit of algorithmic search, concretized in the 15th century here by the type sword. In this sense, while printers worked within a bibliographical order that medieval scribes had built, they also laid the groundwork for another information ecology that would take shape in the 19th century and maybe before with the development of binary code. An information ecology that would take shape in the 20th century with computation. The character, in turn, self-sufficient, codified in abstraction and in isolation through differentiation with other characters. Saussure talks about the value of letters as being, quote, purely negative and differential. I would say that this is an understanding of writing as defined by typecasting and typography. The character will contribute to the shaping of a new reading culture based on a belief in medium transparency, which is to say the idea that the text is fundamentally separate from its material instantiation. The material platform provides only access to the text. It is not itself the text. One doesn't read a physical book. One reads the text that the book contains. As shaped by the belief in medium transparency, this reading culture will prioritize an experience of the text as one of quasi-live interpersonal communication with another human, whether an authorial voice or a character in a narrative. In either case, a contact realized in and through the words on the page, a channel of communication between two lonely beings, is how Robert Darnton put it, talking about a specific example I'll come back to. But we have here two definitions of character that, in their separate ways, speak to something essential about print, which will both mark its difference from handwriting and establish continuities with the digital. In the latter definition, it's the idea that a text is a conveyance of a live human voice, and reading is the experience, often quite literal, of hearing that voice, rather than visualizing letters on a page. It's in this experience that reading is then seen as a key to an experience of edification, a notion that's been integrated into our normative understandings of what reading is. For instance, reading as an exercise in which one can learn to be more empathetic. In my book, I open by discussing a Google search where I asked for the benefits of reading to gauge, kind of hive mind wisdom on what reading considered in abstraction, intransitively reading, not with any object being read, is taken to be. And empathy shows up everywhere in the results, in practically all of the lists. It's perhaps one of the most, or maybe the most common benefit that comes up in these kind of thousands and thousands of lists, all of which kind of repeat the same language over and over again. Another kind of side commentary on these searches is just how present the printed book is in all of these, in this kind of formulaic kind of web text, the 8, I mean, these are all very sort of enumerative lists, the 8 benefits from reading. Empathy is almost always there, and the printed book is always there too, in this kind of very digital web-based reading experience. Reading is assumed to be the discovery of a human world populated by what readers perceive to be real people with whom readers then want and expect to connect affectively, emotionally. This isn't a historical constant. I don't think people have always expected to encounter or hear a live human when they read a written text. But I'd argue it's a legacy we're grappling with in the world of digital text and AI, whether in the context of the interpersonal dynamics of social media, or of chatbots programmed to provide companionship, or merely to answer questions as personal assistants rather than as machines. These technological mediations, generally through written text, though of course not always, are often controversial, and we easily forget how rooted in what I consider print-based practices they are. I'm going to talk about these two interrelated notions of character as a way to think about the continuities and discontinuities represented by print in relationship to the digital, And I wanted to start with a reflection on a very well-known engagement with the question of technological change, which is Plato's discussion of the invention of writing in Phaedrus. The discussion is mostly remembered for Socrates' critique of writing as a crutch that weakens a natural human ability, specifically memory. But there's another less commented on, I think, facet of it, which highlights quite disparagingly writer's thingness, its materiality and objecthood. Socrates noted that, like painting, a piece of writing cannot engage in debate and discussion. It can only repeat its one utterance over and over. This, Socrates claims, reveals the illusory nature of the intelligence that, at first glance, a piece of writing might seem to manifest. You might assume that they are speaking with some degree of intelligence, Socrates says, and by they he means words. But if you wish to learn from them and you ask them a question about what they are saying, they just point to one thing, and it's always the same. To me, this emphasis on writing as brutally material, as an inert, lifeless object, is the more striking aspect of Plato's critique. It is, I think, a more counterintuitive way of thinking about writing's history than the better-known focus on writing as an intellectual crutch. That's something I say we can relate to more easily, and I just want to share this with you. This popped up somewhere in some random sort of collection of news items the other day. Actually, yesterday, as I was sitting on the plane, I saw this man alarmed as his cognitive skills decay after outsourcing them to AI. It sort of encapsulates what I'm talking about. It also sounds to me like an Onion headline. I don't know if you had that. I thought it was satire initially, but it's actually not satire. Today's debates about technology often hinge on such points. To what extent is a new technology weakening what we deem to be essential human capacities on which we had for centuries relied, our ability to do math, or to find and intelligently parse information, or as I mentioned with Burkhart's, to focus and concentrate. I feel it's harder to inhabit the mental space expressed in Socrates' view of writing as language that has been fundamentally alienated from live human interpersonal communication by virtue, simple virtue really, of being reified as an object via inscription. That's not because Socrates' description of writing isn't applicable today. Writing is still a process that gives material, objective, and external form to language that previously existed immaterially in sound or in thought. Today, however, we see this externalization as a feature, not a bug. It's what gives reach and impact to language. It's also, at least with respect to analog forms of writing, what gives language durability and stability. We want, and we have a lot invested in the idea that a text, once committed to writing, isn't going to change from one day to the next. That a book we read and put down on Monday will give us the same text when we pick it up again on Wednesday. This is one of the things I think that most unsettles us about digitized text. We can't be so sure that the text will be the same from one day to the next, or that the text will be there at all, or that where we looked for it originally will still be where we should find it later. I don't think we've begun to come to terms with the ephemerality of the digital. And I won't go beyond making this point in passing here, but it's an area where the shift seems seismic and massively consequential. And I don't know that we have as yet the tools to fully understand it, let alone face it. It might take us a few decades and maybe centuries to figure out what it means to have lost the quality that so horrified Plato, which was this capacity of a written text to just say the same thing over and over forever. What have changed are our expectations and perceptions of writing. For Plato, the notion of writing as dumb, thoughtless repetition was rooted in the sense of a disconnect with the utterance's author. Inscription was for him an act of radical alienation. The written text was concretized in an object, and in the process, completely severed from the consciousness that had uttered it. In this severance, the writing becomes opaque and meaningless. Oops. It's the last part of the quote here. If they are maltreated or abused, they have no parent to protect them, and they cannot protect or defend themselves. We see writing differently today really as the opposite, as a medium establishing a very firm, deep, and reliable connection between an expression and a human conceived as its source, a human whose presence we feel in many cases more poignantly through the written text than through the spoken text. This is what Montaigne kind of affirmed in his famous preface to the Essays, this connection between writing and a self conceived in its deepest truth. I want to be seen in my simple, natural, everyday fashion without striving or artifice, for it's my own self that I'm painting. C'est moi que je peins. In the French, this kind of emphasis on the moi, more present than in the English translation. How do we get from Plato to Montaigne? Walter Ong famously highlighted the interiorization of technology. We become so used to writing over time that we forget writing is a technology. That is a set of tools and non-innate techniques we have to learn and which we use to amplify and extend our abilities beyond what we're able to do without these tools and techniques. We simply stop thinking of writing that way and instead conceive of written expression as a natural human ability, and expanding in the process our notions of natural human ability to include what were the affordances of a technology, this ability to kind of endow reach and durability on utterances, as well as complexity to the degree that we can, in Ong's terms, backward scan, which is return to our written text, revise, edit it, perfect it. Of course, it's important to emphasize that Montaigne in this preface isn't talking about any piece of writing. He's talking about a printed and published book. This is the core question of my own book, Reading Typographically, which looked at how print specifically was engineered to deliver the types of affective experiences of intimate human contact that we've come to associate with reading. Intimate really in the sense of one-on-one. This in spite of the fact that the printed book evolved as a mass-produced commodity, which as an object commanded less and less affective attachment, and as a means of communication was designed to speak in a single print run to tens of thousands. Clearly, I think all of these things are connected. We have a detachment from the material form that sustains or maybe reflects a belief in the transparency of the medium, such that when reading, each reader feels engaged, not with the fungible object in their hand, which exists in multitudes of more or less identical copies, but with a single human voice that each reader is convinced they, and they alone, that's a kind of a complex qualification, but the idea that it's a sort of a personal one-on-one connection that readers feel that they're having with the author, accessed through the object. This is something that's emblematized in patterns we see in correspondence that readers of Rousseau's Nouvelle Héloïse sent to him. These letters, as you know, are one of the big archives of reader response in the 18th century. Samuel Richardson received similar letters which speak to, effusive emotional response and intense connection with characters, as well as with a new type of authorial voice that the characters are often seen as proxies for. Rousseau's readers tended to elide characters and authors, despite the fact that the author presented himself as an editor in that sort of classic gesture of the 18th century. But what especially thematizes the idea of medium transparency in these letters is the way readers frame their reading as experiences of seeing and hearing, that is, of live face-to-face interpersonal connection or interaction. I don't read you, writes one reader named Julie von Bondelli. I conversed with you. You spoke, I listened and answered. Another writes, I've never in my life read with such danger to my reason. I believe I can still see Julie. Obviously, the sort of principal characters of the novel, the tender Saint-Preux, my lord, Claire, all these amiable people. I can no longer put off speaking with you, m'entretenir avec vous. It has now been 2 years that I've wanted to share with you all the ideal conversations I've had with you. This last one, I think at the bottom there, Antoine Jacques Roustan, is one I think really thematizes medium transparency and its staging of the book's disappearance when the reader drops it. My dear master, I read your novel, and 10 times letting it fall from my hands out of admiration and joy, I look for you around me to embrace you. Mm-hmm. As this last letter suggests, what readers wanted from the printed book, and what the printed book was increasingly engineered to do, was to vanish from their sensory conscious experience in order for a very different kind of experience to take its place, an experience that was, at some level, sharply at odds with the reader's current circumstances, seeing or interacting with Rousseau in person or with his characters. I just threw this in here, but of course there's a kind of a pictorial equivalent to this. The representation of readers kind of looking off into the distance and dropping the book. In my book, I explore ways of the production of printed and typographic text was increasingly oriented towards effects of transparency in order to deliver these types of experiences. One well-known technique was recourse to the conceit that the text being read in a printed book was not typographic, that it was oral in the case of narratives framed as the telling of a story, or handwritten in the case of ostensibly found memoir or the epistolary novel. The idea was to instill more powerful emotional bonds between readers and characters by minimizing any sense of mediation. Such text offers, as Lynn Hunt argued, I quote, a vivid sense of reality precisely because their authorship was obscured within the letters' exchange. This made possible, and still quoting, a heightened sense of identification as if the character were real, not fictional. No narrator, she continues, indeed, no quotation marks. This is something I come back to in my book, stand between us and Pamela herself. We cannot help but identify with Pamela. Leaving aside questions of readerly credulity that have focalized a lot of the discussion around what Barbara Foley and Nicholas Page have called the pseudo-factual novel, the novel presented as a set of real documents by living people, whether readers believe that premise or not, whether they were gullible or not gullible. What I want to stress is that the experience of medium transparency described by Hunt is a thoroughly printed one, in tension with the narrative's claim to being non-typographic. What we're talking about is the idea of a printed manuscript, which evokes the intimacy and privacy we come to associate with manuscripts, but as text is fully and decidedly not an actual manuscript, it's a printed text. I like to look at a passage from Diderot's Éloge de Richardson to illustrate the point. Diderot wrote this short essay at the death of Richardson, praising the English author and offering a theorization of what we call sentimental reading. It appeared in early January 1762. You can see there in the Journal Étranger. In the course of the text, Diderot relates a fantasy that comes to him when he dreams of Richardson's work, he says. He imagines that I bought an old castle, and that one day visiting its apartments, I saw in an angle of a room an old armoire that hadn't been opened in a long time. Opening it, I imagine I found in disorder, pell-mell, the letters of Clarissa and Pamela. Diderot then describes how in this dream he instinctively and with great facility put the letters in order. After having read some of them, with what urgency did I order them according to date? What chagrin I would have experienced if there had been any gap in them. Now, anyone who's worked with manuscript letters, and I'm guessing many, if not most of you in this room have, knows that a disordered pile of autographs that one happens to stumble on, perhaps in the drawers of an armoire, aren't going to lend themselves so easily to the kind of spontaneous organization that Diderot imagines imposing. Nor will the generally arduous and long process of imposing such an order impart the kind of effusive reading pleasure, here punctuated by all the exclamation marks, that Diderot describes. Not that there's no pleasure of the archives, that's not at all what I'm saying, but it's not the immediate emotional connection posited here, which we connect with the experience of reading the sentimental novel. For one thing, Diderot is expecting the full legible dates to be on each letter. Not just days and months, but years as well. It's not a particularly safe thing to presume. Diderot imagines that there would be no gaps. All the letters would be there, and he'd be able to fully reconstruct the impassioned exchanges without issue, and thereby be able to lose himself in them as he reads. Diderot's reference to gaps here, the lacune, is to the selections. It's not to the notion that some letters might be missing. It's to the selections and particularly the omissions that the Abbé Prévost had made in his French translations of Richardson, which Diderot was very critical of. It's not the idea that he's not expecting all the letters to be there. He's clearly expecting all the letters would be there. And Diderot imposes this order as if that were the most obvious and natural thing in the world to do. But the reality is that chronological order and completeness are not really natural conditions for manuscripts to exist in. And they're not the conditions in which they're usually read. It's quite the contrary, as any editor will attest. And I'll just skip over this quote, but this is just one of many quotes one could have drawn from a preface to a 17th century edition of letters, talking about the sort of the chaos of the originals, the incompleteness of the originals, the difficulty of dating them. I mean, this is the more normal experience that one would have if one is trying to put together a collection of letters in order to publish them as a sort of chronological correspondence. What Diderot is doing is projecting a set of qualities onto a fantasy of manuscripts that are, in fact, the upshot of print editorial work and print publication conventions, chronological order, completeness, a certain ideal of clarity and ease. These are not inherent to manuscript text, but they're qualities that will enable the experience of uplifting emotional reading Diderot's celebrating in Richardson and in the Éloge de Richardson. They're qualities that, moreover, bring characters to life, as in Hunt's words, real people, easy to perceive and connect with, living their lives in what we might call real time, that we can perceive as if it were almost a movie. To be sure, what we're talking about here with this example isn't pure typography. It's the application of print or editorial processes to the codex. And there's another more purely typographic transformation that ostensibly defines epistolary text. And by extension, their reading experience is premised on it, which is the conversion, whether real or fictionalized, whether you're talking about actual letters or kind of a fictional letters. But the conversion of handwritten into printed letter forms. And this is a reference to characters in the other sense of the word. I mentioned what I take to be the defining gestures of print, gestures that constitute a kind of logic or order. I noted the idea of the locked-in form, which by instilling the locked-in form, which instills a kind of belief in the existence of copies. Which instills a kind of belief in the exactness of copies. I mean, leaving aside the question of how exact those copies might really be, but a belief in the exactness of copies gives rise to an expectation of medium transparency. Another gesture, I think, is embodied in the punch and matrix from which type sorts are cast. This order was imposed on the plenitude and variety of letter forms that had proliferated throughout the later Middle Ages. This variety included, of course, many different scripts reflecting historical evolutions and geographic variability, as well as genre. Different scripts were used for different types of texts, from Bibles and liturgical texts to vernacular writings to bureaucratic documents to works of antiquity. Within each of these texts, there was also substantial variety, variant letter forms, and especially shorthands, ligatures, abbreviations, other kinds of contractions, often meant to make the process of hand copying more efficient, which is to say, more economical with respect to space and time, but at the cost of multiplying the signs and symbols that a scribe would use and that a reader would have to be able to recognize. These shorthands leveraged handwriting tools and techniques, the fact that you can save time and space by not lifting the quill from the page, or by compressing and combining letter forms and so forth. I'm not going to say too much here because this is well beyond my comfort zone and expertise, but I'll evoke Christopher de Hamel's description of the compression in the Paris Bibles of the 13th century as, quote, more extreme than in any other period in the history of European script. Hardly a word of a mid-13th century Bible is written in full without some contraction. Printers, as we know, initially imitated the great variety of scripts. I mean, almost all of them used, I don't want to say all, because I'm sure there are exceptions, but tried to imitate what they saw used in 15th century handwriting, and they generally did so in line with existing conventions. Formal Gothic for liturgical text, the more rounded bastarda for vernacular writings, and so on. They replicated the abbreviations and combinations. But what had made hand copying more efficient was a burden for printers. The expanded character sets required very large fonts. Gutenberg used almost 300 separate glyphs to print the 42-line Bible, which of course made things more, not less difficult, both for typecasters who had to, of course, create a much larger family of letter forms, and for compositors who were pulling from much bigger typecases. Roman typeface was, one of these renderings in typography of contemporary script, here of a script developed by Italian humanists for copying the writings of Latin antiquity. This humanist handwriting must have, and I'm being purely speculative here, appealed to printers in that relative to other scripts, it used somewhat fewer shorthands. I mean, there were plenty of abbreviations, but somewhat less than in the other styles. Moreover, the letters were more articulated, requiring fewer ligatures and variant letter forms. What then seems logical in a way, but also I suspect historically unprecedented, is how quickly printers consolidated around Roman typeface to the exclusion of the other letter forms, with the important caveat, of course, that this process happens at different rhythms in different places. And some places, of course, this history is much, much more belated than what I'm looking at. I work in the Latin language world where the shift was pretty stark. Within a few decades, around the 1530s and 1540s, all of the associations of script with genre, function, geography, and so forth are broken by printers. And everything is printed in increasingly standardized Roman typeface, no matter what the content is. Roman type quickly becomes a kind of zero-degree writing, a default font for every word processor, and by word processor here, I mean typesetters and printers. What's notable is how quickly this happens to the point where literary publishing projects shift midstream or from one edition to the next, from the bastarda faces conventionally used for vernacular texts to Roman type. Here you can see Rabelais' Pantagruel and Gargantua from 1532 and 1544 set in a typical bastarda. But then on the right here, the Quart Livre from 1548 is in Roman. Interestingly enough, I don't have any great explanation for this. The tiers livre from 1546 was set in italics. Here you have Marguerite de Navarre. We see a similar situation. The Miroir de l'âme pécheresse, first published in Bastarda in 1538. The 1533 edition was printed by Antoine Augereau in Roman type. This edition also included, for one of the first times, maybe the first time, I can't remember, the accents that would become standard in French, in modern French. And maybe even more remarkable than the speed and decisiveness of this shift, and here I feel more confident in saying it's unprecedented, is the durability of Roman typeface over the ensuing 5 centuries, compared to the previous 5 centuries. It's one of those facts that seems so obvious we don't think about it, but the alphabet, as reimagined through Roman typeface, has been extraordinarily stable. And this includes into the digital age. The digital age has been massively impactful in so many ways, but not when it comes to letter forms. The 1960s and 1970s had imagined the future of writing incongruously through the highly pixelated primitive screen technology of the early computer era. But let these images stand as a kind of warning against overconfidence in predictions about the future. We read the New York Times online today, or we write papers in Word in fonts derived more or less directly from the Roman faces of the 16th century. Garamond there on the right, to compare with these digital typefaces that are very much predicated, very much in the tradition of the Roman typeface that Garamond would give birth to. I began my book with a chapter on 18th century debates about typeface and the search for easier to read characters, fueled by the same logic of disappearance I discussed earlier. I won't get into the details here, don't have time for that, but I'll just quote one interesting interlocutor in these discussions, a certain citizen Sobry, who wrote during the Revolution and describes the ideal typeface as being so easy to read that one shouldn't even think that one is reading. This is another twist on the typographic invention of the manuscript. Real manuscripts are also often, sure, not always, but often quite hard to read at the level of the lettering, a fact that Diderot also leaves unmentioned. The effort of deciphering prevents immersion. Conversely, the ease of reading type, and in the event Roman type, is yet another precondition for the affect of reading that relishes in the experience of no barrier, to adapt Lynn Hunt's language, between reader and character or author. Yet, as reflected in the triumph of Roman type, print also marks an inflection point in the history of computational approaches to text through the imposition of a formalized system for encoding characters. This is represented not by code points mapping characters to a sequence of bytes and bits that any computer can interpret, but by steel punches and copper matrices, which similarly held and defined an ideal form of the letter, conceived in isolation from other letters through difference with them, as Saussure had said, easily repeatable through type founding, and easily identified, classified, not to mention counted. My hope is that these two, concluding here, my hope is that these two stories of characters hint at a counterpoint to discourses on technological development that have been more drawn to discontinuities than continuities. I think in part because the continuities are harder to see, either because we just don't see them, or I think more often because they seem so obvious and natural that we don't see them as such. We've internalized the forms of letters as these have been reimagined by typography and by the dominance of Roman type, much as Ong argued we have internalized writing itself. It seems unnoteworthy that chatbot output would come to us in more or less the same fonts that typecasters of the 16th century first forged. When you ask ChatGPT for its font recommendation, you see the first name that pops up is the name that's perhaps most associated with the triumph of Roman type, at least in the 16th century, and from my Francocentric perspective. What we might fail to appreciate in this answer is the extraordinary continuity that this represents, with digital text and AI no more than the latest iteration of a longer history, which is, the regime of the character, much as the introduction of printing technology was the latest iteration in the long history of the codex. Garamond steel punches are, I think, still usable today. In fact, they're still sitting in the collections of the Imprimerie Nationale and being used at the end of the 18th century. I finish on this. I asked ChatGPT to render its last answer in Carolingian script, and I had an ulterior motive, which didn't quite pan out, and I won't go into that. But I thought I'd end with what ChatGPT provided me with this DALL-E representation. I mean, using image generation AI software, which recalls Lisa Gittleman's talk. And I feel kind of encapsulates everything I just said, perhaps more eloquently than I said it. And I feel we should start with a discussion of this image. But I'll end here and open up a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darren. Floor is open. I guess it's a transitory thing, but at this moment, as soon as we see AI credited, don't we discredit it?
I mean, I think some people probably do less, discredit it less than others.
Yeah.
I mean, you get these big boosters of AI. I mean, I had pruned this talk a little bit. I had thinking about the kind of rhetoric around the revolutionary nature of AI. I had wanted to quote, the report that every university has an AI task force putting out reports, and we have that too. And we are, one of the sort of AI's big at the University of Washington, as you might imagine. It's the land of Microsoft, Paul Allen land. So they are taking AI very seriously, and this AI task force report, sees this really transforming everything we do. I mean, I don't think that they would discredit AI output. They see AI as plausibly replacing instructors in some way. I mean, they see it as taking a very kind of central role in pedagogy and teaching, and doing so reliably without any real sense of problems with that. So yeah, I think it depends who we is. I mean, it's a complicated one because it's a very polarizing debate.
Yeah, I mean, in this moment, there's peculiarity that we open up a computer screen, and in one corner there is like the AI digest of content that's labeled as AI, and then the real content is just to the side. And if we read and compare and contrast, we see that the AI is getting things wrong.
Yeah, so this is, we're all being taught and being asked to learn how to read AI, precisely for these problems. And so clearly Google feels like, because they've made the links easy to find, which I appreciate that. I mean, when they get their sort of AI digest, there's always a little link sign, and it will try. I mean, I don't know how accurate it is. I haven't sort of really tested this. It tries to give you as accessible a link as possible, but clearly that comes out of a sense that the AI answer in and of itself isn't sufficient.
Zach?
Thanks for that. So if I understood you right, I mean, part of what you are arguing about the relationship of print to character in the personality sense of character is that the sort of the perceived fixity, standardization of print is part of what lends it the transparency that is in turn part of what the readers of like Rousseau, what enables them to think that they're directly, contra Plato, right? That they're like actually engaging with a real person. And that's an intriguing argument, kind of extension of some of those old debates around fixity and standardization. Then it makes me think about the AI, like when the chatbot starts to feel like a real person. It sort of feels like the reverse to me, like it's the like variation and the divergence from a perceived fixity of a computer program. Like when I was a kid, there were those chat bots, like there was one that pretended to be a therapist, and
Eliza,
exactly. But it was too fake. Like you knew you could replicate. If you ask a chat bot the same question twice, like you're going to get a different answer. You're going to get it's the variation from what, and that is more like what the quote from Plato is about, right? That like the writing always says the same thing. The chat bot does not, but the book does.
Right.
So I'm just wondering how you
Yes, it's a very good question. Yeah. So the Eliza thing is an interesting one because lots of people really did believe that, the person who created
believe that it was a real person.
Yes. Yeah. And the person who created Eliza spent the rest of his life kind of regretting having done that. he felt like he had created something dangerous by doing that because, and I think what it gets to, I mean, yes, obviously if you use ELIZA, and I remember as a kid learning to program, and programming a kind of simple ELIZA was one of the things you learned to program.
But you were
It's
just
not-
guessing a
it's not-
million inputs.
Yes, it's
that's
just
all.
random responses. And so it's obviously not a very sophisticated thing, and it's not responding to people in a very nuanced way. But I think that there's such a level of desire for there to be that interaction that people were nonetheless somehow wanting to see in that back and forth with this computer, a real person. So I think that's really the thing here. It's not so much the object itself, and I think that that's maybe part of the problem with the debate about did readers of Rousseau really believe Julie existed or not? Like, that's not really the question. The question is why they wanted to, I don't think they really believed she existed, but they clearly were sort of invested in the idea that so I think you do have that with ELIZA. So I mean the danger is sort of on the side of humans more than the technology, like playing off our desire to want to see something, a human there. No matter how sophisticated the program is behind it. Now with the chatbots, that was another section I'd cut out. I mean, one of the things that, I mean, at one level, the chatbots, you'd think were more sort of sophisticated interlocutors because they are responding to context. I mean, they're not just kind of saying the same thing over and over again. But there's a lot of consternation. I'd quoted this article by actually some colleagues of mine at the University of Washington on the dangers of stochastic parrots, which has become a kind of a celebrated sort of critique of large language models. I mean, the idea that they precisely play on this human desire to want to see it, but in a very dangerous way. That article kind of sounds like Plato, really. I mean, it's saying that this is an illusion of intelligence. There's no real intelligence here. There's just an algorithm behind this intelligence. But there's the reality that, in fact, it's adjusting more, certainly, than a printed book does. So it is different it does seem to me different than what Plato was saying. But I mean, it raises the question, I mean, why we're so prepared to believe that a printed book is speaking to us as a person, and yet we have problems when the machine's doing it. To me, that's an interesting question. Emily Bender and her co-authors don't have any problems with the idea that although people at the time in the 18th century did have problems with readers thinking that Julie were real, but we don't have problems with that today. Like, I don't know why.
Well, that's the whole thought of Don Quixote. Right?
Yes, exactly.
He's
Yeah.
reading ChatGPT.
Well, this is an excellent point. I mean, there was lots of moral consternation about what the effect that these books were having on people today, in the 18th century and before, which we seem not to have today. So I don't, I think that's the kind of question I'm interested in pursuing. I don't know quite why there's that disconnect, if it's just sort of time passing. I mean, 200 years we'll feel the same way about ChatGPT, or maybe in 20, 30, 40 years we'll feel the way we do about ELIZA today. But I think, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the idea of the Turing test and when machines will pass the Turing test. But in some ways I think, well, printed books have been passing the Turing test since, I would say, the 18th century, that they've been speaking to us as people, and we've been prepared to sort of assume that this object, this machine, this kind of manufactured thing is a person. We've had no problems kind of making that substitution for a couple of centuries. But so why we don't have that, I think we probably, at some point did have that anxiety about the printed book. We don't anymore. What can we learn from that in relationship to how we're trying to understand AI today? So I don't have an answer to your question, just that I think it's an excellent question.
Okay.
Not to talk about, I don't mean to talk about Don Quixote
Yeah.
in this. Be careful.
I'm gonna start with an expression in the title you give to your talk, the analog history of AI. Analog raised this issue, which is a relationship between your last book and what you have presented today. I think the main aspect of the last book is to say that the material devices, including character, but not only character, had the function to forget the materiality of the text. And you have one of the quotations, which was particularly explicit, the idea that we create a kind of immediate relationship between finally the reader and the author speaking, when you have the material devices which are able to erase the materiality, the perception of the materiality of the text. So do you want to apply the same kind of model of intelligibility for the present situation, in which the device of the artificial intelligence would be to make forget that it is artificial?
Oh,
And
wow.
so here leads to the analog history. Do you think that, because there is a tension in what you said and what you wrote in the presentation, between the fact that perhaps you can defend the idea of some continuity where and when everyone is focusing about the discontinuity. And so in this sense, the analogy would be a fact that you say, yeah, artificial intelligence is inhabited by the technologies of the predigital era. And so in this sense, the analogy is referred to the form of historical continuity. But perhaps we can also think differently. If you observe, it seems to me, that there are radical discontinuity, in this sense, the analogy would be perhaps a construction by the artificial intelligence to erase the idea of the artificiality, and in this sense creating a historical continuity, when in fact you have a profound morphological discontinuity. So how do you apply, if you want to do this, what you have constructed about the print culture and the materiality erased as such by material devices, when you are dealing with the artificial intelligence? We can follow up, because to defend the idea, perhaps not again what you wrote, that there are much more radical discontinuity, even if it is disguised and it is suppressed by the rhetoric of the non-artificial.
Yes, I mean, I certainly believe there are radical discontinuities. I thought you were going to ask me about the materiality of the digital platforms, because that's another question too. I mean, the sort of the tradition of medium transparency and how that prepared us to kind of work with digital text in ways that perhaps we wouldn't have been able to or would have done very differently. So, the continuity of that tradition in the digital. But I mean, thinking about the artificial, yeah, I mean, clearly this is the anxiety, is that, artificial intelligence is trying to disguise its artificial nature, and people like Emily Bender and critics of artificial and critics of large language models, and particularly which are specifically designed to sort of hide the fact that they're artificial and that they're producing natural language, should do more to kind of signal that they're artificial. So I mean, it's similar in that sense. I think also in the sense that kind of Zachary brought out, that all of this is playing on a similar, I think, tendency in the user to want there to be a person there, and to not somehow accredit the information more, become more kind of emotionally connected if they believe that this is the language of a person, or that this is a person speaking rather than a machine. And if that's done in the way as to seem like sort of delusional in a way, like that it's a machine, that can be dangerous. The people can be kind of manipulated through these technologies in sort of nefarious ways. But I mean, the technology underlying that is, of course, completely different. I mean, artificial intelligence, large language models, I should say, it's not all artificial intelligence. I mean, large language models are, I mean, they don't, they're not dealing with this kind of, I mean, they're not dealing with this moment of passage from the importance of kind of dematerializing the platform. I think that's sort of been done. We already sort of disconnect content from material platform. We already kind of try to sort of separate the text from the thing that is being delivered to us. I mean, we don't really have any consciousness of the computer, as we're kind of losing ourselves in what it's presenting to us. So yeah, I mean, here it's dealing with a different problem, which is the problem of how it's generating this kind of illusion of natural language by developing these predictive algorithms based on being trained in massive amounts of text. Yeah, I don't know if that was a particularly satisfactory answer to your question, but certainly there's great discontinuity there, even as the sort of, I think, the underlying anxieties that are being played on are similar.
I mean, I'd like to ask you about something that I think was missing from your talk. You brought forth, again, many examples of people who are saying the book is speaking to me, the characters in the book are speaking to me, so that is an auditory metaphor of reading. Wherein all this is our auditory environment, books on tape, or plugging earphones.
Yes.
And I mean, so the literary text is, for many people, no longer something that you're looking at, but rather something you're hearing, where the characters are indeed quite literally speaking to you. So where does, I mean, in that case, like the print
Right.
as printed character is bypassed completely. How do you work that into
Yes.
your discussion?
That's a very good question, and it's true. I haven't addressed that at all. Obviously,
no time like the present.
yes, I know,
Yeah.
and it's something I need to look at. I mean, this is obviously a very significant way that people are quote unquote reading,
Yeah.
particularly novels, I think, and texts that we kind of associate with these traditions of absorption, often in these very sort of distractive environments, driving or so yeah, I don't really have an answer to that question other than I recognize it's not there, and that this is an important sort of fork in this series of questions that need to be addressed about how we go from things I'm talking about in the 18th century to better understanding our environments today.
I think question there. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about if you like what you if you are thinking about the phenomenon of like the medium becoming transparent and people like dropping the book and looking away from the book versus like maybe potentially a modern phenomenon of people being very precious about books. So can you showing the search results of people saying about the benefits of reading, and they're like so focused on the experience of like holding the book and smelling books, and like I'm just kind of wondering how those put together.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And clearly when you go back to those sort of benefits of reading sites, and you see kind of the presence of the printed book everywhere, and these sort of reading gestures that are curling up with a book, fundamentally associated with reading a kind of an object. I mean, clearly all of this exists in the shadow of the digital, reading books, means something different today now that we do that in a context where most of our reading is digital. So the sort of physical, there's a kind of a return to the physical nature of the book, though it's not a appreciation of the physical book that you would have seen in the 16th century, for example. It's not the sort of disappearing. I mean, you sort of want both, these sites talk about both absorption in a text the way that, you might see having some connection with what we're seeing in the 18th century. But none of Rousseau's readers were talking about really curling up with their book. I mean, they're surprisingly silent about the physical book. I mean, something I've noticed going through all of these correspondences. I mean, they hardly ever talk about the actual physical book themselves. They seem indifferent to it. The only time they really talk about it is when there's a defect, if it's like a counterfeit, or if it's a pirated edition, or if it's incorrect, like then they notice the physical book. So they're not, I mean, Darrington at one point started to talk about this typographic consciousness of the 18th century, but you actually don't really see that. And especially if you're connecting that with what came before, they're surprisingly unconscious of the physical book. Today's a bit different. I mean, today's, I don't quite know how to characterize it, because I think at the same time, on one hand, there is clearly an appreciation with a type of reading that we associate with the physical book, with certain kinds of gestures. Books are just as commodified. It's not like the books that we're seeing in those images are fine letterpress printed books or anything like that. I mean, these are just books that were bought at Barnes and Nobles or whatever. So it's not like that's any different. I don't know that they're necessarily appreciating the physical book as an object anymore, but it's imposing certain gestures and practices, not distraction, the opposite, being kind of disconnected, an ability to kind of focus on one thing without having a bunch of notifications pop up. I mean, it's sort of forcing a certain type of reading through its objectness that, that they're appreciating, without necessarily being about the sort of beauty or singularity of the object itself. But it's a great question. I mean, it's true that there's definitely an ambivalence about that, or sort of an ambiguity, I should say, about that.
Yeah, but this is a great conversation. Thanks, Geoffrey. Without, denying any of the dissimilarities of that you guys have just been talking about, it seems like you could say, I wonder if you could say even more about some of the ways in which current critiques of AI might resemble worries from the 18th century. And that painting that eroticized painting you went by quickly is, one of the critiques is being lost in the book. One of the critiques is being distracted
Yes.
from the world by the book, or fantasizing. There's a whole series of kind of, the anti-Richardsonian polemics that are pretty severe. And I don't know, since you're thinking about comparing these times and places, I wonder if there's more to say about our own rhetoric of critique, some of which you're engaged in yourself, I think.
Yes.
And how it does or doesn't resemble the reams of, Parsons and whatevers who were pretty worried about those readers.
I think there's a couple things. I mean, there's the connection, even earlier with Plato and sort of the idea of illusion of intelligence. And this is something that comes up a lot with critiques of artificial intelligence, that it's not really intelligence, it's an illusion of intelligence. And that's because, but it's, how you get there to get to Roget's question is very different. I mean, this is through kind of algorithmic recombinations of text that have been, on which it's been trained. So it's producing something that looks like it's conscious language, but it's not, or it's not communicative. It's the idea of whether there's an intent to communicate in the language. And of course you get the more moralized type of stuff. I mean, I think I showed quickly, there's the reference to character AI, these chatbot based websites that are there to provide different kinds of companionship to people. I mean, I think there are people in the medical world who see this as a real solution to things like loneliness and depression, friendship with a chatbot, but it's something that would perhaps inspire a certain amount of moral concern, whether that's healthy or not, or whether that makes sense. And I know that there have been all sorts of issues. I mean, there was I think somebody who had gotten into a very sort of intense relationship with one of these chatbot characters on character AI ended up committing suicide. So these become very kind of fraught situations that create all sorts of opportunities for moral critique of these. So I mean, I think the question is, it gets back to Zachary's point. I mean, in looking ahead a couple hundred years, like, how are we going to think about this? I mean, we're sort of in the moment now and trying to sort it all out. Are we going to be more like the way we feel about novels today, which is that they are, if you go to these websites, and I mean, that's the other thing that comes out in these websites, like, what are the benefits of reading? And you can see that the presumption is always a certain type of reading. It's reading print. It's also reading novels, where there are people being represented, and that the experience of reading is about connecting with these people through the text. We see this, I think almost unequivocally as kind of healthy and good, positive. It makes us more empathetic. It makes us able to focus more. It makes us better able to kind of relate with others. Like, there's really very little, you see nothing negative in these sites. I don't know where you go today for contemporary negative critique of the kinds of experiences that people have when they read novels. I don't know if that exists. Where? Right. Yes. So is that going to be the case in 200 years with AI? Who knows?
Yeah, and I don't know, this great transition in the history of the novel, which I'm so behind on. I'm 25 years out of date on history of the novel scholarship, so I don't know what people are working now. But the great transition away from epistolarity toward the grand narrator, the all-seeing, the, omniscient,
Right.
right, we know the Dickens and George Eliot's, it's a hugely different way born out of some critique of what,
Yes,
those kinds of
yeah.
earlier novels weren't doing for readers.
Yeah, I mean, there was the argument that, readers became more sophisticated, and they understood better. I mean, the 18th century readers were naive. They didn't really know how to read they didn't know how to read a kind of third person, objective, third person impersonal narrator. So they needed these kinds of devices from the 18th century in order to kind of connect. And then in the 19th century, I mean, this is not a debate that I particularly engage or get into, but the reference to, Barbara Foley, for example, sort of the history of novel forms which become more and more kind of real. It's the history of realism.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's what do we take as reliable and credible representations of reality? I think that's sort of underlies this investigation, and the extent to which chatbot generated text can do that. I mean, this gets to your question, Jerry, about the links we need. Right now we still need anchors there. We need sort of sources. We don't just accept what the chatbot answer is. How that's going to evolve, I don't know. Maybe in the direction of the novel, as you suggest, where we'll just become more and more confident in those answers and not need the links and not have all the doubt about whether this is accurate or not.
Looks like Peter has.
Yes, I have a question in the chat. This comes from Barbara Williams-Elliotson. She asks, could we say that the process of evaluating the accuracy of an AI search result is on a continuum with a reader's need to evaluate the reliability of an author in any form of text? And in regard to the illusion of fixity with printed books, would you speak a bit more about interpreting AI results and readers' own creations of meaning during the process of reading?
Could you reread that?
Yeah, first part.
Yeah.
I'll read it again. Could we say that the process of evaluating the accuracy of an AI search result is on a continuum with a reader's need to evaluate the reliability of an author in any form of text?
That it doesn't really have anything to do with the technology or the platform.
I guess
It
that way.
has to do with I mean, certainly that would be true. I mean, obviously certain things that the stakes are higher than in others. I mean, the truth value of a statement matters more in some contexts than in others. So that would certainly be true. I mean, the other question is just our natural sense of confidence in the technology and the platform. And
The second part was in regard to the illusion of fixity with printed books. Would you speak more about interpreting AI results and readers' own creation of meaning during the process of reading?
I mean, AI results are famously unfixed. So, I mean, that gets to, I think, your point that they are much more adapted to the individual user responding to prompts and even, to the same prompt. And of course, a function of the algorithm itself, which is always generating something different. So there's just a lot of instability in the output there. There's not a lot of fixity at all. And so that's part of the concern about reliability too, is the fact that it's, the answer is going to change depending on when you ask it, or how you slight variations in the way you ask a question might create sometimes substantial differences in the response you get, just because it's triggering the algorithm in different ways. So you're not really dealing with fixity there. You're the opposite. It's something that seems very unstable. I hope that answered the question, or began to answer the question.
Thank you so much for this talk. It gave me so much to think about, and my question is just to ask you to say more about an idea, because I don't have like a fully formed question. I was wondering if you could talk more about the idea of immersion, and like how you see, because when I think of immersive, I mean, there's this sort of idealized immersive reading that we all hopefully occasionally still experience. Like immersion with the digital, where people can feel totally locked in.
Absolutely.
And there's kind of accompanying revulsion, I think, too, that sometimes also occurs with material text. But I was just wondering if you could say more about what you're thinking.
Yeah, so that's a really important sort of distinction and qualification. I was talking actually in class the other day This, it's a little bit like the inventor of Eliza, who then spent his life regretting having invented that. Apparently it's the same with the inventor, which is a little JavaScript program of infinite scroll.
Oh, yes.
And this is, of course, a kind of a device that encourages it really kind of addiction to whatever you're getting out of sort of scrolling through what you're looking at. So of course, yes, I mean, this is a qualification that I had to make in the book, that when I'm talking about immersion, I'm talking about a specific experience, which is the experience of kind of losing yourself in a representation that you're reading in a text. Imagining you're sort of either a spectator or even sometimes part of this world where you're kind of interacting with characters and you're sort of inhabiting this world as if it were the same, equivalent to your world, as if you could do that. And that's different from the other kinds of immersion that are in a way, well, I mean, I think that kind of reading can be addictive too, perhaps, but we think about as sort of addictive where you can't stop from going through whatever it is, like some sort of social media feed, or this happens with gaming too, that you spend hours and hours in a game. I mean, and gaming actually is kind of immersive, perhaps in both senses of the word. But that's, I mean immersion in that specific sense of, being not unable, but sort of not distinguishing or taking the text you're reading as a representation of a world that is entirely equivalent with yours. The characters, these discursive constructs that are being represented in it are actual people that you can imagine interacting with and talking to, and that you're sort of pulled into that and you're experiencing it as if you're a part of it.
Thanks.
Sure. Yes, I hope that answers your question. Peter.
The next Zoom chat question comes from Jessica Linker. How do fortune-telling books or other interactive forms play into your narrative? There are books that provide different answers depending on what you ask.
Oh, that's a great question. And I haven't thought about that. So I'm glad to actually have that concept, that idea and reference. I mean, that would connect with AI in a way. I mean, sort of you're asking a question and getting an answer that's in a way kind of predetermined. I have nothing more to say other than that. I never thought about that, and that's a great kind of reference and something to look at. I mean, these printed forms that are there to kind of provide answers to questions and sort of pre-engineered to provide answers to specific kinds of questions.
Zach?
I mentioned kind of glibly Brett as a joke, but he does have a whole list of the dangers of taking characters for real people. And then it does make me wonder when I think about AI, like particularly the chatbot model of AI, therapist, how it would look different if instead of thinking about AI in relation to history of the novel, we think about it in relation to history of drama, which is a different experience of people, right, enacting a fiction. But there's a very different sense of reality, or of distance from that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, it is textual. You're reading. I mean, drama's textual, but it's not.
A lot of people, more and more people I know who use ChatGPT, they turn on the voice and they
know it's true, and that gets to the sort of books on tape issue too, the kind of auditory aspect of all of this. Yeah, that's a great point.
You can choose from the voices you want.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is characters. I mean, character AI. This is the idea is that you pick a character from a novel or whatever.
So you're teaching Shakespeare. You have any idea, and your students are mostly reading plays online. Probably. You think some are listening to plays online?
No.
Okay.
That would be another step.
That would be a nice return of the.
No, I doubt it. I think they're mainly.
Question in the corner.
Yes, thanks very much. I just sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek question about your very last slide.
Yeah.
I was struck by it, especially in light of your excellent point about the surprising lack of change in typography in the digital age. And yes, we see in this last slide something, a case where, if I've understood it well, you've prompted it to give you Carolingian script, and it's generated something that's obviously not Carolingian. Forward to a future in which AI, as it increasingly becomes interested in image making, goes off the rails maybe and starts redesigning scripts left and right.
Well, this was, I mean, this was kind of Lisa Gittleman's point from a few weeks back that there's a sort of real disconnect between what AI can do when it comes to text, and by text I mean strings of characters, encoded characters, and what it does with images, the kind of representation through images of written language. And there's a real disconnect there. It means something. I mean, I'm not totally sure what. What I was looking for was different. I mean, and this came up again from an experiment class from earlier in the year, where students, we'd asked, I mean, I was co-teaching with a colleague, asked students really to kind of experience writing as a technology by a little exercise, had to write a paragraph, but then they had to either find a typewriter and type it out. I mean, we had a typewriter provided them, or they had to kind of imitate some script. So like really experience writing as a technique that they had to kind of learn and think about. And some of them were trying to get away by using ChatGPT, and they handed in these sort of submissions where they claimed that they were doing it in some sort of like historical script, and all ChatGPT was doing, and claiming that this answer was in whatever that historical script was, and all ChatGPT was doing was using some kind of like script font of some kind, whatever had been sort of connected to the interface. And I don't remember what it was, but it was one of these ridiculous kind of flourish script fonts that you can find in Word, and claiming that this was like Carolingian minuscule or you know, whatever that they were saying that the script was. It's actually another version of what Lisa Gittleman's saying. Like there's just such a disconnect there between the LLM's ability to kind of understand graphically its language and understanding it kind of computationally as a series of encoded characters. Like it wasn't aware, it just understood that it had this font that was connected to handwriting, and it just output that. And it didn't matter what, all handwriting was handwriting. It didn't matter that it was we're asking for a very specific thing, but it was unable to kind of process that. So yeah, I mean, there's this kind of disconnect there that I don't quite know what, you know, where that's going, or what I mean, I feel it reflects something important, both obviously in what Lisa Gittleman's talking about, I think also in what I'm talking about here, the sort of the abstraction of language such that the graphical representation of it almost doesn't matter, you know. I mean, it's necessary for us because we read by looking at letters on a page, but for the computer, obviously that's not at all how it reads. It reads by understanding character encodings. So that disconnect.
Last question from Lynn.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna make a comment because I know that people right now are working on programs that will allow them to translate, you know, to do that work of figuring out what's on the page
Well, it's
in
OCR,
different
yeah.
scripts.
Handwriting.
And presumably once enough of that's done, maybe you would get a better
Yeah.
response when you put in something for a Carolingian script
Absolutely.
or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this gets to OCR and handwriting recognition technologies.
Yeah,
And
text gets taken up.
yeah, and these are really important. These are critical technologies really for this kind of remediation of text into digital forms where we can then sort of find them and search for them. I mean, it's what's connecting a computationally readable text with an image of the text that we as humans will read. So it's very important. I mean, clearly ChatGPT is not trained to understand any of that.
Oh, no.
And these tools that are being developed will be able to do that much better. And I'm sure once it's been programmed to reproduce a Carolingian minuscule, it will do that. I mean, the problem with ChatGPT is it's programmed never to say, I can't do that, or I don't know. So it's always going to make up an answer. And it's programmed to kind of do everything and nothing. And that's one of the big
And that's the difference between it and HAL, right?
HAL was programmed to
I-
complete the mission.
I can't do that.
Yes,
Dave,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
When it realized something was going to be an obstacle to completing the mission,
Yeah.
it did what it had to do.
Well, on that note, we continue to do what we have to do. And unfortunately, one of those is bringing this session to a close, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks all of you.